So my interest in racing, I started quite late. I didn't get into racing until I went to university, actually. And it was whilst I had all the spare time in the day that I was trying to fill in between lectures, where racing, being a product that is on every day, throughout the day, really appealed. One of my friends who I met at uni, he was very much into racing. He started passing on some tips. We had a couple of bets, and then before you know it, here I am, after thankfully a successful first winning bet. And I think that was it. That was the hook, and I was in from there.
Winning always helps, that's for sure. Maddy?
Definitely. I stumbled upon racing by chance, really, and through television. We mentioned social media and sort of that helping improve, get more people into the sport. But yeah, I was actually watching the morning line, Channel 4, and I was basically too lazy to get up and turn my TV off on Saturday mornings. So that gives you an insight into just how I got into racing. And it slowly built up from there. I must say, first and foremost, the attraction was with the animals themselves. You know, horses are beautiful, beautiful animals, and they are at the epicenter of the sport for me and for everyone else. So it was from that, and it sort of built up from there. That I got into racing through journalism and through Channel 4 and through Racing Post. So yeah, by chance, but something that I'm very, very, very glad that took off.
Isaac?
Yes, hello everybody. I began to the horse racing when I was very young. My father bring me a lot to the race course. So I became to be interested in that sport, and I love it. And I am fond of a lot of sport, especially football, tennis, but I love also the horse racing because, as we talked about a few minutes earlier, it's the only sport we have, I think, a betting culture behind that, and I love that. I love the betting aspect, and that's why I work now as a journalist at EPMA and Paris Turf, and I made a study from journalism, general studies, and then I became a journalist after internship in Paris Turf. I love it, and right now I write, sorry, and I do commentaries on EPMA, and I think that we will talk about it, but we can do much better things to attract young people, but I will say it later.
Yes, we'll certainly talk some more about that and explore that further, but Romane?
Hello. In fact, I was attracted by horses first. I was a horse rider, and then I studied law, and I discovered horse racing by a untypical way, because it was by doping cases. So I just think, oh, what a fascinating thing. So then I went to race courses, and I discovered the big gap between what we think about racing and what is really racing. This is why I did another internship in the French Thoroughbred Association, and I understand deeply what was racing. And after, I joined an association called les Jeunes with friends, and I went every week and every weekend to race courses, and I discovered all this fascinating world better.
Great, and finally Solange.
Hello everybody. My father is trainer, so I had the chance to know horse racing since a very long time. And I rode as a amateur jockey, and after I was used to bring my friends to horse racing, and I would like to do this more seriously and deeply, and that's why I'm part of the association les Jeunes today.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for your introduction, but let's dig a bit deeper. And I'm interested to find out what barriers or obstacles that you might have had to overcome to actually engage with the sport initially. Did you find it too complex, too complicated, for example? What were your initial experiences?
Yeah, mine revolves around complexity of the sport. When I was growing up, those who are from the UK will remember a programme on a Saturday afternoon called Grandstand that was on BBC One, and that would show every single sport you could think of, including skiing and whatnot. And I would sit there and I would watch every single one of those sports until the racing came on. Now this is when I was 10 at my nan's on a Saturday. And it all just became a bit too complicated and, as we touched on earlier, boring at that point. So I just used to turn it off. and then I missed out on years and years of racing until, as I say, I went to university. So as a young lad growing up, it was the complexity side of things.
Yeah, I can relate to that as well. I come from a family, I didn't know anyone who was into horse racing at all. It was totally foreign. And as I say, I stumbled upon it by chance. And initially I was actually quite embarrassed to be involved in racing. It sounds horrible now, and I realise that's not true, but as a young female being into the sport, I think it came with a lot of negative connotations about gambling and, you know, being irresponsible and things like that. So I was actually quite embarrassed of being into racing. I kept it a secret for a long time. I didn't actually tell anyone until, I think, from a personal perspective, I gained the confidence that actually, you know, it's a fantastic sport and a great product. But yeah, I did, I guess, sort of socially say that was the barriers that I faced. They were probably self-imposed, but I do think racing can do an awful lot to break down some of the stigma surrounding it and diversify and get a different group of people interested in what is a great sport.
Well, that certainly chimes with me and my experience. It's a long time ago now, admittedly, but you know, it was very furtive and secretive to begin with because it wasn't socially acceptable to say that you were into racing and betting, and you know that in itself provides a barrier that we forget. Although I would say that obviously it's more socially acceptable now than it perhaps was even just 10 years ago, due to the sort of increased profile of betting on other sports, for example. But do you think, Isaac, if I could ask you, do race courses make sufficient effort to attract young people, do you think? What would encourage you to go racing more often?
I have a lot of friends who don't know about horse racing, so I try to bring them to the race course, and when they came with me, they always say, oh, that's cool that you're with me, because we don't know nothing about the sport, so it's very difficult for a newcomer to come into a race course and see what can I do in a race course. So it's very difficult for a newcomer. I think that you can do a lot of things. First of all, the entries, you can do much better. You can, if it's free, or you can give a checks for betting checks. Sorry, it can be much better. You can, if you can say to people, you can bet on horses. I think they will progress in that domain, and they can do a lot of different things too. The food, I think the food, it's very expensive in France especially, so if you can do more cheaper prices about that, it can be better, because the young people look a lot about these aspects, sorry. And of course the major things, as the three people we were here before, they talk about is the betting. It's very difficult for a newcomer to understand which horse they can choose. And of course, if you are, I think that it's very difficult to explain to somebody, but if you have the more aspects, the more elements you have for somebody, it's the better thing you can have, because I think it's, if you have, it's from they try the tracking, if you try the tracking and you do it a lot of elements in the tracking, the speed, all the colors, which horse is I bet for, it's very it's better to know. So you can do a lot of things better, I think, and there is a lot of other, the communication also about the professionals, but they try to bring in Longchamp, for example, with the jeudi, it's good, but I think that we must be proud about our world. Sometimes in horse racing, we wanted to do something with a concert, with a football game, but I think we must promote our champions like we did with Trev, and we must do that, I think, more often, and it's not enough for me right now.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, we will talk a bit more about the packaging and presentation of the sport later when we look at race tracking, which is an interesting topic in itself. But you also mentioned there that you obviously have to champion racing and explain betting to your friends and colleagues when you go racing. For Romane and Solange, if you don't have a champion, how do you think race courses in particular, but also racetrack betting companies should be going out of their way to engage with first-time racegoers, novices and newcomers?
I think we must build like icons in other sports, for example, with trav, but also with jockeys, because they are part of the sport. And the particularity of racing is that it's the only sport practice by a couple. So we must create icons, jockey icons, and for example, for betting, we should bet on only riders. For example, friends told me they only bet on Soumillon, Christophe Soumillon, because if they bet on Soumillon, they think it's a better jockey, so they will win. And if it's not a winning bet, never mind, because it's the icon. So they have the paper, but on the paper it's only numbers. So we must see on screens the name of the jockeys and the name of the horses, because when we go to the screens and to bet on physical, not because the application of PMU in France is quite well built, I think, because we can see the name of the horses and riders, but on physical way to bet, it's only numbers. So we are very stressed, and 6 minutes before the race, we must choose a number, and we can just fail. So it's a pity, I think.
I think you're right in terms of some of the barriers that the technology itself has put in the way. But I remember when I was first involved, we forget how important personalities are, because I used to do a Frankie Yankee every Saturday when watching Channel 4 racing. Unfortunately, I stopped betting on my Frankie Yankees when he actually did win all 4 races at 35,000 to 1. But never mind, that's another story. But I'm interested, Solange, from your perspective, what personalities, both equine and human, do you think we can promote to the wider world? In the same way we talked about earlier with the likes of Messi or Ronaldo, how can racing compete against that?
I think it's important to create links between people, and that we do with Aux Courses Légende. We talk about not only stars or something like that, but just about the little story about this trainer or this horse or this owner, because it's a great story. Everyone can imagine to live the same, and I think it's not just about stars and just about everybody, every horse, maybe just a little horse which wins just 1 or 2 races, but it's a beautiful story, and we have to tell it.
If I can just jump in, Jason.
Yeah, sure.
In my job, there's a lot of PR work, and that's arranging interviews with jockeys around the media. And you'll find in Britain, at least, that in terms of horse racing, the only real things that transcend the sport are Frankie Dettori to start with, the Queen, and then you're looking at the flagship events like the Grand National now. Unfortunately, the Queen can't go on forever. Frankie, much to his protestations, got about 5 years left. And there's going to be a real void in Britain for a public face to put towards racing once Frankie retires. And I think what would really help the sport is if the jockeys realise this, and that even if they realise that there's an opportunity to promote themselves and make themselves millionaires and household names just by opening up a bit and showing a bit of emotion and a bit of charisma. You've got some of the young jockeys coming through like a Sheen Murphy now who sort of fits that bill, and they've all had media training now that they're coming through, and the importance has been realised, but there will be a massive void when Frankie retires eventually.
I think you'll make really important points here about personalities, telling the story behind the racing action, whether it's about jockeys, whether it's about the horses. But as Solange said, doesn't have to be about the stars. I mean, one of my favourite racehorses was a mare called Dizzy that just captured my imagination. It did eventually win at the Cheltenham Festival, but actually was going most of the time around small tracks like Kelso, for example. But people, I'm sure each and every one of you will have a personal story like that about a horse that just won your heart or captured the imagination. I think we need to do more of that as a sport to tell that story. But moving on to betting, we see a lot of advertising now focused on betting for other sports, but not so much racing. So we get a lot of football bombarded by adverts all the time through live matches, particularly during the World Cup. But we don't necessarily see racing cutting through. So how can we market the sport through betting to the next generation of online customers? Who'd like to have a go at that first? Isaac?
I go, but it's a difficult question because, as I said, for a newcomer, it's always difficult to say. As if you see an advertise on the TV and you watch something about influence for the PMU, it's difficult to see. Oh, I want to play and gamble on the horse racing. So I think that we can give all the stuff, all the elements, as I said, to give to the better the way that they can play on a horse, and everybody has his manner to manner is English word, I don't know, but his way is better to play, to gamble. And I think that if we I don't know if as we say, the pari mutuel, the fixed odds, is something to play with. I'm more like, is it accessible or not? And that's just for me the most major question about that, and how to make a newcomer come on the horse racing.
So in terms of that accessibility then, obviously we live in the internet age. I talked about all the social media channels available to us now, with mobile technology. Is the way that you consume racing as a generation, do you think, different from more traditional audiences? So, you know, mobile betting, video on demand, etc. Maddy, the Racing Post do a lot of this.
Yeah, exactly. And from a personal perspective, I mean, I often tell people I wouldn't be interested in horse racing if it wasn't for Twitter, which would probably sound a bit mad to a lot of people, but that was how I gained people who were like me, who were enthusiasts and who really were into racing. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been... my eyes wouldn't have been open to people in the industry in the same way. I think as well, as you say, social media is constantly evolving. News these days, being a journalist, you have to react so fast to everything. So if you're not on Twitter, or if you're not embracing different channels of social media, whether that be Snapchat, Instagram, whatever, then you're really putting yourself at a disadvantage, because as much as print and newspapers are fabulous and a great source of information, that information was probably available a lot earlier than when you read it. So it's all about getting the results instantly. And I think, you know, the more that's embraced in racing, the better, because otherwise the world's going to move on, and it's really something that we need to think about investing in more.
Romane, perhaps you could expand upon that. From in France, do you think racing and betting organisations employ social media effectively to attract younger racegoers?
In fact, no. For me, not at all. Because before going to a race course, I've never seen any advertising from racing. Because, you know, you see what you can detect what you see before. But the advertising is the money you put on advertising is low in France from organizations, because they are monopolistic in France. So there is one French authority and the PMU, but if they do not do effort, anybody can do it, because. For example, we are from an association, but we can do some links, but we cannot do advertising. So because of this lack, race courses are empty. This is just a constat.
A particular problem in France, I think. You know, we heard earlier from Nigel how in the UK a lot of promotion has gone around. You know, kids going free, bringing in new first-time racegoers and so on, and big campaigns around that. Have we not seen anything like that in France then, Solange? What do you think we can do in terms of the marketing and advertising and promotion of racing?
We have to seduce young people, I think, in the future, and maybe we can do links with what they know. I take an example. Everybody know Peaky Blinders, for example. It's about bookmakers, horse racing, gambling. So maybe I think we can maybe do a link in France with this kind of thing which are famous, which impressed people, and I think we have to to bet on it.
Can I add?
Please do, yeah.
In France, we have also the Kids Go Free called Les Dimanches au Galop. I think it's a success, but they are just little customers and they don't pay their entry. So it was a failure from institutions in France, I think. It was to avoid the 18 to 30 customers because they pay their entry. It's not the parents who bring them to race courses, it's them. So they pay their entry and they pay the drinks and the food. So this must be focus, and prices should be very low for them because they are the customers. They will be the future customers. They are. So if you avoid these customers and who have also the first income, so they have a little money, and not everybody, but some people have a lot of piece of money, but they don't have yet a family sometimes, so they can put money on a horse, or they can put money on drinks or on food, or to go, for example, at the Arc, because it's so exceptional. So we must focus on this kind of population.
You're right. I mean, obviously, it's good for us to start racegoers young and bring them in at a young age, but of course they can't bet until they're 18 anyway. They can't bet until they're adults. So in terms of actually engaging with the sport, it's quite difficult. So focusing on that 18 to 30 group then, what do you think we can do to encourage them to bet on racing? I mean, is it through pari mutuel? Is it fixed odds? Did you start betting on other sports first before racing? What worked for you, Chris?
Well, I always started my betting with racing, actually. I think when I'm pushing the 30 barrier quite heavily here. So when I first started to bet on horse racing, there wasn't that much football betting available, or it wasn't as socially acceptable as it now is. So I started with racing and then moved into football or golf and into some of the other sports. I think in the UK, in terms of the 18 to 30 market, there's a massive push now to get students racing as much as possible. There's free entry at Ascot in 2 weeks' time for British Champions Day. I know that rolls out across the Lockinge at Newbury and those types of things. And I think within race courses, whilst there is a lot more that they could be doing with social media, they do a hell of a lot more now of digital marketing, which they've never done before. So they're going out onto Facebook and onto Twitter. They're posting adverts that appear in your feed. Once the algorithm kicks in, it's targeting the right people. It's not just targeting people who have got little to no interest in racing whatsoever. But yeah, I think that's a great place. And if the racecourses and the bookmakers as well could up their social media game, I think that could be massive for them. Racecourses don't even tend to have their own social media person at the moment. It's pushed onto the marketing team to look after and to push offers out and to big up the race days, whereas and people like us can see straight through that, I think, and we can see that it's not genuine and not authentic. Yeah,
I think that voice of authenticity is so important, particularly employing, as you say, the new media channels that are available.
Sorry, I also think that with bookmakers, they could all do with getting their own identity. They're all latching onto this sort of lad persona where they're just trying to mock people and just to get likes and retweets, really, when that's not really an effective way of driving people towards your website. And I watched a video yesterday that Bet365 pushed out where they were breaking down the MMA fight this week between Conor McGregor and the Russian guy with the really long name. And it was really insightful, and that made me think, oh, well, maybe Conor could get a first-round knockout because this is how he attacks, this is a weakness in his game, and that would make me much more inclined to then go and have a bet with Bet365 rather than them just posting cheap shots, basically.
I think it's a really interesting point in that, you know, they reinforce stereotypes about betting by actually targeting a very narrow audience, and very rarely are they speaking in a tone or providing content that's actually relevant to millennials and to the next generation, you know, so perhaps they're missing an opportunity. So maybe pari-mutuel operators can fill that void because they are, dare I say it, you know, they're not as they're not positioned in that way in the market. They're certainly not seen as laddish. They're seen as more broad in their appeal. They're very much based on the racetrack, for racing, by racing. So what can pari-mutuel operators do to entice you to make that your preferred way of betting? So overcome some of the complexities or barriers that might exist.
Yeah, you mentioned the complexities, and again, I've not really been in an environment where I've bet using a pari-mutuel much, and I think, if I was put in that environment, it's a case of breaking down everything surrounding that. And for novices as well, we talk about getting new people into the sport. It's simplifying it and not making it something that's daunting, or if you get it wrong, it's a mistake, or it's just about being inclusive. And you mentioned about the lad persona, and that's how bookmakers are sort of selling. And I think that's quite damaging. Like you say, it would be really refreshing if someone could come forward and actually be inclusive and be really, truly representative of a younger audience.
And Isaac, when you look at other sports, what do you think they offer to young people that racing doesn't? What opportunities are we missing?
Of course, if you look at a football game, you must bet on it. You must choose one team or a draw. So it's of course more easier, and the bet is more simple. But you can do or more complicated. But in horse racing, it's much difficult, and I think that it's Maddy. That's as Maddy said. It's you must more communicate, and I think that we didn't mention that. Chris did it, but I insist on that too. The trainers and the jockeys must communicate more, I think, to bring people. We don't insist on that, but I think it's a major part of the sports too, because they are we watch the jockeys. When we want to know about a performance, we ask the jockeys, we ask the trainer, and we must insist on that, because I think especially in France, it's difficult to talk with the jockeys, with the trainers. Not all of them, of course, but when you must know about the sports too, I insist on that. It's not only betting, and I don't like to compare always football and horse racing, because it's not the same thing, and it's something different. If you can like it or you can don't dislike it. So for me, it's very different, and I think that if the communication is much better, like a trainer in France did a communication like you can come in my stable and watch how I train the horses. I think that kind of thing is very good for the newcomers if you want to see it. Of course, it's difficult to bring the people, but if you do a communication on Twitter, on Facebook, it's of course much better for the young people.
Can I just interject as well and say, you've touched on things like social media, and one race course that's, I think, particularly forward in using their social media is Leopardstown. They're on Snapchat a lot, which again is opening up doors for them in terms of a younger audience, and actually, again, touching on access, getting people up and close with the horses, the jockeys, the trainers, and behind those closed doors that perhaps we're not really accustomed to going. And I think it's all about getting new people, what's happening behind the scenes as much as it is on the track. For instance, if a horse is arriving for a race, watching them, going through that process, talking through what happens when a horse arrives on a race day. And as you say, when sort of racing personas realise that the media is now a bit of a responsibility, and that it's something that should be celebrated, that'll be a really positive step, because I think sometimes people can be very closed to new ideas and new things like that. And I think the more that we open up, the better that racing will be for a new audience.
Great. Finishing off then, we just wanted to touch upon some of the technology as well. That's a key theme for today, and how that could engage the next generation. So obviously we have things like race tracking that you talked about earlier, and we'll be talking a bit more about that later on. But racing as a sport is very data rich. We could offer more, I think, in terms of the packaging and presentation of our sport, to offer more detailed, in-depth insights into performance analysis in the same way they do in other sports. How important do you think this is to you, Solange and Romane? Would that sort of attract you to engage with racing and betting more?
Yes. I think it's very important to show to the public that horse racing is a real sport, that jockeys are athletes, and thanks to the tracking we can show that, and we have to communicate on it and to use this science. I think it's very, very important.
And from your point of view, Romane?
Yes, of course, but I think we should not use data as a complicator thing, because when we know anything about racing, data from racing, full data from racing will be very complicated and maybe will close the world. So we must choose some data. For example, in some articles or things, there are the rhythm from heart of horses, and it's everybody knows about it. So okay for this, okay for the same for jockeys, and maybe the time and maybe the records. But I don't think we must communicate on all the data, or it must be very well chosen, because otherwise it will close. It will be a complicated thing, I think.
I think that's a very important point. It's all about the packaging and presentation of that, simplifying the sport, but giving people access to whatever information they think they might want or need. So there's always a fine line between making it too complex, too confusing, but also giving people all of the information that is engaging. So finishing off then, I'll just go down the row very briefly. If you could just summarize, if there was one thing that you could change about our sport, what would that be, Chris?
I won't go too much into it because we've spoken about it a lot already, but it would be around the jockeys and making them a bit more responsible with their media commitments. I think if you look at the way that in the UK especially boxing and darts have risen out of the doldrums, boxing wasn't very socially acceptable either for a long time, and darts was a game that people played in the pub, and that was it. And now they're both huge sports that turn over millions and millions of pounds every year in the UK, and that is because they've got big personalities at the forefront of it.
Thanks. Maddy?
Well, we spoke about affordability and attracting new people to racing, and for me, one of the things that I would change is if you go racing on a big day, there's often lots of different enclosures segregating people, and with that comes different dress codes and how pricey things are. And I think in a lot of ways, obviously it can't be done all the time, but if racing could open up those boundaries and have set fees for introducing people into the race course, have more broader dress codes so that more people feel like they can attend a race meeting, that would be better, as opposed to sort of archaically segregating these people into sort of class systems. I think it would be great if we could all enjoy the sport under one umbrella.
Great. Isaac?
Yeah, I agree with the communication part, sorry, and also the accessibility, and I will go further with that, because I think that if we can facilitate, make easier the newcomer to go to the betting, because it's very important to me, the betting place in horse racing, because without bettors there is no racing in France, I guess, and I think that we must make more simple, as Hans said it here before me, and I think that if we can give to the new bettors some facilities to betting, like we said to the tracking or all the stuff like that, we can push in that side, and I think it will be a major part of the job. Of course, there is a lot of other things to do, but that's very important to me.
Great. Romane?
For me, it will be the gathering effort, because we must gather people in communities, and it's not incompatible with the free access or the open access, because they will come back if they see their friends. So we must promote owners association or association of betting with application with friends, between friends only, and we must also gather disciplines just for the horse, between horse riding and horse racing. We must build links, very easy to do, and so we must build events on horses with the both disciplines, I think.
Great. And finally, Solange.
Yes, I think it's really important to create links between people and to develop storytelling like that. People will be interesting in our sports and they will bet on it for sure.
Brilliant. Well, thank you to all 5 of you. Some really interesting insights there, and I'm sure there'll be some interesting takeaways for our audience today, and hopefully they'll think about that with their marketing and promotional strategies, particularly with regards to social media, but also the way that we package and present the sport too. Any questions from the floor, please, for any of our 5 panelists? Does anyone would like to ask any questions while we have our 5 young people here? I don't see any hands, so I will just wrap up now by saying thank you very much to all 5 of you for coming today. A really interesting insight. Thank you.